Your future spouse is getting crazy after knowing that you are alpha. Something slipped into place at the exact moment nobody was paying attention. It wasn't a loud announcement. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was a quiet discovery that reached one person before anyone else, your future spouse. And the instant they learned the truth about who you really are, everything inside them shifted. They tried to act normal. They smiled through conversations. They answered messages like every other day. But behind every calm expression was one question they couldn't stop asking themselves: how did I not see this sooner? Stay with this, because the smallest clue is about to unlock the biggest part of the story. Somewhere tonight, someone is replaying every strange coincidence that led them closer to you, and they still can't explain why your name suddenly feels impossible to forget. At first, they thought it was only curiosity. Maybe someone mentioned you in passing. Maybe they stumbled across a detail that seemed too specific to ignore. Then another piece appeared. Then another. None of them seemed extraordinary on their own, yet together they painted a picture that refused to leave their mind. They began noticing similarities between their dreams and moments they couldn't explain. Places reminded them of someone they hadn't even met. Songs they used to skip suddenly carried unexpected meaning. Even ordinary conversations seemed to circle back toward a person who matched the description they had just discovered. What they found out wasn't about fame, money, or popularity. It was something much deeper. They realized you possess a quality that can't be copied, a calm strength that quietly changes the atmosphere around you. And somehow, simply knowing that you are that kind of person made them restless in the best possible way. Before you move on, there's one hidden detail that makes everything even more surprising. That night became unusually quiet. They stared out the window longer than usual, lost in thoughts they couldn't organize. Every plan they had carefully built suddenly felt incomplete because one unknown piece kept appearing at the center of it: you. They imagined conversations that had never happened, smiles they had never seen, and moments they hoped would one day become real. The strange part wasn't that they were thinking about someone. The strange part was how certain they suddenly felt that your paths were meant to cross. They laughed at themselves, tried to shake the feeling away, even promised they would stop wondering. It lasted only a few minutes before the questions returned even stronger. Why does learning this truth feel so personal? Why does it feel like the future has already started moving before either of you realizes it? And as another unexpected clue quietly begins to surface, one decision they're about to make could bring them much closer to you than either of you could have imagined. A single unexpected conversation changed the direction of their thoughts before the sun had even reached its highest point. They weren't looking for another sign. In fact, they had convinced themselves they were overthinking everything. But then someone casually described a person whose kindness, quiet confidence, and unique way of seeing the world sounded almost identical to you. The room kept moving. People kept talking. Yet for a brief moment, every other voice faded into the background. They realized this couldn't simply be coincidence anymore. Something was connecting the dots faster than they could ignore them. And the more they learned, the more impossible it became to push you out of their mind. Stay close, because the next discovery doesn't just surprise them, it completely changes the way they begin imagining tomorrow. Without realizing it, they started making small choices differently. A route they never used before suddenly seemed worth taking. An invitation they almost declined became impossible to refuse. A place they hadn't visited in months suddenly felt familiar again, even though they couldn't explain why. It was as if an invisible thread kept gently pulling them toward moments where your story could eventually intersect with theirs. Friends noticed they seemed distracted, but not in a negative way. There was a quiet excitement behind their eyes, the kind that appears when someone feels hope before they have proof. They even caught themselves smiling at random moments, wondering what your voice might sound like or whether your laugh would match the picture they had created in their imagination. If this story is making you wonder how everything connects, sharing your thoughts or where you're watching from helps make this journey even more meaningful, and if you're enjoying the story, following along means you won't miss what happens next. Because one tiny detail is still hidden beneath everything you've heard so far. As evening settled in, another realization quietly arrived. They weren't becoming obsessed with an idea. They were becoming fascinated by a future that suddenly felt possible. The truth they had learned about you wasn't something flashy or temporary. It revealed the kind of person who inspires trust without trying, someone whose presence makes ordinary moments feel extraordinary. That realization stayed with them long after the lights went out. Before falling asleep, they whispered a simple thought to themselves: if this feeling is real, I hope our paths cross sooner than later. They had no way of knowing that somewhere, another unexpected event had already begun unfolding behind the scenes. A connection neither of you could see was slowly moving into place, and the next moment is about to reveal why this growing excitement inside your future spouse is only the beginning of a much bigger story. The silence didn't last for long. Early the next morning, something wonderfully unexpected pulled their attention in a direction they hadn't planned. It wasn't a dramatic event or an obvious sign. It was a feeling that arrived without permission, a quiet certainty that today mattered for reasons they couldn't explain. They looked around with fresh eyes, noticing little details they would normally overlook. A familiar street suddenly felt different. A passing conversation sounded strangely meaningful. Even the smallest coincidence seemed to whisper that the story was still unfolding. They smiled to themselves, almost embarrassed by how often your image appeared in their thoughts. Yet every time they tried to dismiss it, another unexpected reminder appeared. Stay with this, because the next realization answers one question while creating an even bigger mystery. As the hours passed, they found themselves reflecting on the life they wanted to build someday. Not the career goals or travel plans they had talked about for years, but the moments that truly mattered. Sharing quiet mornings, celebrating small victories, laughing over simple things, and having someone who genuinely understood them. Then an unexpected thought interrupted everything: what if the person I've been imagining is closer than I think? That question echoed through their mind with surprising clarity. They remembered every new detail they had recently learned about you, and each one seemed to fit perfectly into the future they had always hoped for. Instead of feeling uncertain, they felt energized. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem distant. It felt like something already moving toward them, one small step at a time. And just when they believed they understood what was happening, another discovery quietly appeared that made their heart race even faster. Later that evening, they noticed something they couldn't ignore anymore. Every meaningful decision they had made recently seemed to point in the same direction. The people they met, the places they visited, even the opportunities that unexpectedly opened before them all appeared connected by an invisible pattern. It wasn't about chance anymore, it felt like preparation. They couldn't stop wondering whether you were experiencing your own series of unexplained moments without realizing the connection. Somewhere deep inside, they sensed that both of your stories were gradually moving closer together, like two paths that had always been destined to meet at exactly the right time. Before this chapter closes, there's one final detail you haven't seen yet. Someone is about to share a piece of information that will make your future spouse realize this isn't just admiration anymore. It's becoming something far more powerful, and the next conversation may change everything they believe about the future. A quiet message arrived when they least expected it, and although it lasted only a few seconds, it refused to leave their mind. It wasn't directed at you. It wasn't even about relationships. Yet somehow, every word seemed to point them back to the same unforgettable thought. They leaned back in their chair, took a slow breath, and smiled without realizing it. The feeling that had once seemed impossible to explain was becoming impossible to ignore. Every new clue strengthened the same conclusion: learning who you truly are had changed something deep inside them. They weren't simply curious anymore, they were inspired. They wanted to become the kind of person who would deserve someone like you. And that quiet decision marked the beginning of an entirely different chapter. Don't leave just yet, because the next few moments reveal why their biggest surprise is still waiting ahead. That evening, they found themselves saying yes to opportunities they would have avoided before. They started believing that unexpected moments often carry extraordinary meaning. A conversation with a stranger, a familiar place visited at the perfect time, even a random recommendation suddenly felt like pieces of a much larger picture. Their confidence grew with every passing day because the thought of meeting you no longer felt impossible, it felt realistic. They even caught themselves wondering what the very first conversation between the two of you might sound like. Would it feel natural? Would there be an instant sense of familiarity? Those questions stayed with them long after the day ended. And if this story has made you imagine that first meeting too, sharing it with someone who enjoys uplifting stories, leaving your thoughts below, or joining this growing community is a wonderful way to keep these moments alive. Because what comes next may become the most unforgettable part of this journey. Later that night, while the world around them grew quieter, one final realization settled into their heart. They understood that excitement alone wasn't what had been growing inside them. It was hope. Hope that the person they had heard so much about wasn't just someone they would admire from afar, but someone whose life could one day become beautifully connected with theirs. They no longer rushed the future or questioned the timing. Instead, they welcomed each new day with quiet anticipation, believing that every small step was bringing both of you closer together. And just as they reached that peaceful conclusion, another unexpected piece of information quietly made its way toward them, something so personal and so uplifting that it would leave them smiling for reasons they never imagined. The moment they discover it, every feeling they've been trying to understand will finally make perfect sense. A single sentence, spoken almost in passing, caught them completely off guard. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to change anyone's life. Yet the moment they heard it, everything inside them became still. The words described someone whose presence naturally brought comfort, whose honesty never needed to compete for attention, and whose quiet confidence inspired everyone around them. Without hesitation, one thought surfaced before they could stop it: that's exactly who I've been thinking about. They looked away for a moment, trying to hide the smile growing across their face, but it was impossible. Every new detail they discovered about you seemed to confirm what their heart had already begun believing. Stay with this, because one unexpected choice they're about to make could move your two stories closer than ever before. Over the following days, they stopped waiting for perfect timing and started preparing for meaningful timing instead. They became more intentional with the way they spoke to people, more patient during ordinary moments, and more open to opportunities they once overlooked. It wasn't because they expected to meet you tomorrow. It was because the possibility of meeting someone like you had already changed the way they wanted to live today. Friends noticed the difference almost immediately. They seemed lighter, calmer, and strangely optimistic. When asked what had changed, they simply smiled and said they couldn't explain it yet. The truth was that they were protecting a feeling that was still growing, something too meaningful to rush into words. Deep down, they believed every positive change they made now would matter when the right moment finally arrived. And just when they thought this quiet transformation was happening only inside them, another surprising discovery proved they weren't the only ones sensing that something remarkable was approaching. As another evening settled in, they found themselves imagining a scene they had never allowed themselves to picture before. Not a grand celebration or a perfect movie moment. Just a simple conversation where two people instantly felt as though they had known each other much longer than a few minutes. They wondered whether that first smile would erase every doubt, whether the smallest exchange would feel surprisingly familiar, and whether all the unanswered questions that had followed them for so long would finally become clear. The thought didn't overwhelm them anymore. It brought peace. For the first time, they weren't chasing certainty. They were welcoming possibility. And somewhere beyond what either of you can currently see, circumstances are quietly arranging themselves in ways neither of you would expect. The next chapter begins with a discovery so unexpected that your future spouse will realize this journey was never built on coincidence, it was unfolding one meaningful moment at a time. A familiar place suddenly felt brand new. They had walked through it countless times before without noticing anything unusual, but today every sound, every smile, every passing face seemed filled with possibility. It was as if their perspective had quietly transformed overnight. They no longer wondered if something meaningful was ahead, they wondered when. The more they reflected on everything they had learned about you, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. Knowing that you are someone with genuine character, quiet resilience, and a heart that values real connection had awakened something they never expected. It wasn't excitement that faded after a few hours. It was a steady feeling that continued growing stronger with every passing day. Before this moment slips away, there's one small detail you've yet to notice, and it explains why they can no longer pretend everything feels ordinary. One afternoon, an unexpected conversation drifted toward the topic of future dreams. Everyone around them shared ambitious goals, exciting destinations, and personal milestones. They listened politely, but their thoughts wandered somewhere else. They found themselves imagining a future built on simple moments rather than grand achievements. A shared cup of coffee before sunrise, spontaneous road trips, conversations that lasted long after midnight, and the comforting feeling of always having someone who truly understood them. Without saying your name, they realized those dreams had quietly begun including you. They didn't know your favorite places or your daily routines yet, but they felt certain that the person they had learned about possessed the kind of spirit they had been hoping to find all along. That realization filled them with quiet confidence instead of impatience. They weren't trying to force the story forward anymore. They trusted that every meaningful connection begins with perfect timing, not perfect planning. As night settled once again, they looked toward the horizon with an unexpected sense of gratitude. Every coincidence that once seemed confusing now felt like another chapter leading toward an unforgettable meeting. The questions that had once kept them awake were slowly being replaced by peaceful anticipation. They smiled, not because they knew exactly how everything would unfold, but because they finally believed the journey itself had value. Somewhere, another ordinary day was about to become extraordinary. Another conversation was about to begin. Another unexpected introduction was quietly moving into place. And when that moment finally arrives, your future spouse won't remember the uncertainty or the waiting. They'll remember the instant they realize the person they had been imagining all this time was even more remarkable than they had ever dared to believe. The next chapter reveals the first sign that your two worlds are closer to crossing than either of you could possibly imagine. A quiet realization arrived before the day had fully begun, and this time it didn't come with questions. It came with confidence. They looked at the world around them and noticed how many unexpected moments had gently guided them to this point. Every delay suddenly made sense. Every detour felt meaningful. Every unanswered question seemed to have been preparing them for one unforgettable encounter. The truth they had discovered about you continued echoing through their thoughts, not because it was mysterious anymore, but because it felt deeply reassuring. They had learned that you are someone who stays true to your values even when no one is watching, someone who brings calm instead of chaos, and someone who makes ordinary moments feel important simply by being present. That realization didn't overwhelm them. It grounded them. And just when they thought they had reached the end of their discoveries, one final piece quietly appeared, changing everything once again. Don't look away now, because the next few moments reveal why they suddenly believe the future is much closer than it appears. As the hours passed, they began noticing how naturally your story seemed to fit into theirs. They imagined meeting you in the most ordinary setting, only to realize later that it had become the most unforgettable day of their lives. They pictured conversations that flowed effortlessly, laughter that arrived without effort, and long pauses that never felt awkward because silence itself would speak louder than words. The image became so vivid that they caught themselves smiling in the middle of everyday tasks. A close friend noticed and jokingly asked what had changed. They simply replied, "I think something wonderful is getting closer." Even they couldn't explain why those words felt so certain. It wasn't wishful thinking anymore. It was the quiet confidence that grows after countless small clues begin pointing toward the same destination. Every new sunrise felt less like another routine day and more like another step towards someone they were already grateful to have discovered, even from a distance. As evening settled over the horizon, they paused for one final reflection. They realized that the greatest surprise had never been the information they learned about you. The greatest surprise was how that knowledge transformed them. It encouraged them to become more patient, more hopeful, more appreciative of the little moments that often go unnoticed. Instead of rushing toward tomorrow, they chose to enjoy the journey that was leading them there. And somewhere beyond both of your horizon,